Alrighty, time for another episode of Shattered Legacies Deep Dive. Today's episode is a bit of a big one. It's one that I've been wanting to do for quite a while, however, we can't get to the proper topic right off the bat. We need to talk about some other organizations first. However, without further ado, let's get into the topic. When it comes to Shattered Legacies, there are obviously many different issues. Well, I guess issues isn't the proper word. Many different threats that arise. These can be relatively minor threats that threaten maybe only a single city or metropolitan area. There are larger threats that may threaten an entire mega city or, God forbid, an entire planet. Then there are even bigger ones. We're talking about planet-spanning wars that can cover an entire solar system, even quite literal galactic-sized wars that take an entire galaxy within its hellish landscape. Then, of course, you have even larger threats, ones that can even go universal in the extraordinarily rare situations. However, the Cyratin Empire is largely capable of handling any and all of these threats, as well as the majority of the other species. However, there are threats that simply throwing more bodies at the problem just isn't an option. The equivalent of throwing Warhammer 40k's Astra Militarum constantly at the problem when there is no benefit whatsoever. When it comes to factions that are as large as the Cyratin Empire, as large as the Imperium of Man, the value of the individual soldier becomes essentially non-existent. Millions upon millions of lives may be lost within a single engagement, and that can sometimes be considered an optimal situation. However, as I've been getting to, there are situations in which just constantly throwing more bodies and more machines at the problem just isn't enough. It's these unique type of situations the Cyratin Empire send in some of their strongest, some of their quite literally most apocalyptic warriors. And I'm not talking about the Cyratin Marines or Marauders. Today we're going to be talking about some of the most powerful warriors the Cyratin Empire has at its disposal to throw at any problem that simply the standard armed forces and super soldiers and massive fleets of the Cyratin Empire just cannot handle. Now, in order to truly get into this, we need to do a bit of power scaling, and we're going to start at the lowest level, this being what is known as the Cyratin Commander. Cyratin Commanders, of which there are 4, are a relatively high rank within the Cyratin military. In fact, they're the 3rd highest rank. Cyratin Commanders are in charge of an entire branch of the military. One may be in charge of the entire Navy, whilst another one may be in charge of the entirety of the armed forces, another in charge of all super soldiers, and the 4th being in charge of other, whatever that may end up entailing at the time. Cyratin commanders are expected to travel across the battlefield, bringing death and destruction to anything that dares get in their way. That being said, they are far from the most powerful thing the Cyratin Empire can throw at any given problem. That being said, they are individuals who, given the proper set of situation, or the proper set of circumstances and situations, can easily take out an entire army by themselves. We're not talking about tactics here. We're not talking about strategies or traps. We're talking about pure physical or magical prowess. Commanders are quite literally designed to be sent into a battlefield and be able to more or less change the course of the entire battle on their own. Now, we don't really have any true named Cyratin commanders. We have one right now that is named. The other three haven't been named yet. The current Cyratin commander that has been named is known as Magnolia. Bit of an interesting name, honestly. However, you'll kind of understand why. Magnolia is the very definition of a femme fatale. Anytime she walks upon the battlefield, she uses her beauty to beguile all of those around them, unleashing hell and destruction upon any who dare to come near them. Now, when we had talked about the demon legions, we had talked about a specific type of demon, specifically the Devourer Succubus. Now, within Shattered Legacies, succubi are not what they're normally portrayed as. They are not demons that attempt to coerce men into, shall we say, intercourse in order to take their souls. Rather, they usually use forms of charming rather than actual, Devourer demons do it somewhat differently, and Magnolia is unique amongst even them. As we had said, Devourer succubi are considered to be royalty when it comes to all different succubus subspecies. They're considered to be the kings and the queens. They're the most powerful, and oftentimes, if given the proper situation, they can easily become archdemon level. That is considered incredibly powerful. Usually when we get to archdemons, you require specialized task forces or entire armies to deal with them. Usually when it's demon lords is roughly around the time the super soldiers start getting sent in. Well, wouldn't you know it, Magnolia defied the odds and is currently a demon lord class demon. Now this means she is incredibly powerful. Should she ever go rogue, it would require an entire squad, maybe even up to an entire company of Cyratin Marines in order to bring her down. Or one of her fellow commanders, or somebody who has a hell of a lot more weight than she does. However, Magnolia isn't casting massive fireballs that explode with nuclear power. No, Magnolia's ability is simply known as charm, and it is most commonly seen as a pink miasma that goes across the entire battlefield. It possesses no scent, it possesses no taste. The air doesn't feel heavier or anything. You just see this pink cloud of fog come in. And at first you think, well, that's incredibly weird, but there's nothing going on. It's not affecting anybody. And that's because the effect isn't noticeable. Those who are particularly weak of will or may not have a sufficient level of magical resistance are quote-unquote charmed. This is most commonly seen in the fact that the irises within an individual's eyes will turn from their normal color to a light pink color. However, unless you're looking for it, you don't really notice it. Now, that may sound like an incredibly weird thing to say. How would you not notice somebody's eyes suddenly turning pink? Well, it's because it has this sort of illusion. If you're actively looking for it, you can see through the illusion, and if you're particularly magically powerful, you just automatically see through it. But for your common soldier, they'll never notice. The entire time, Magnolia is walking through the battlefield, oftentimes dressed to the nines, with no opposition. And the second that anybody actually shows any true opposition to her, such as soldiers that are completely encased in armor in a sort of EVA suit, it's oftentimes far too late. Because with a simple click of her fingers, anybody who is affected by the charm turns essentially into mad, love-crazed berserkers. They'll do anything and everything that Magnolia will tell them, and will protect her life even if it costs them their own. As a result, when she strides onto the battlefield, it's not too uncommon to see fellow allied soldiers to suddenly go into a berserking rage, firing in every single direction, pulling knives and jumping at things like they're fucking Rambo, and just all around complete and utter chaos, unless you're in some sort of enclosed environmental suit, or hell, even in an airtight tank or something like that. There is a pretty good chance that you're going to be affected by her charm. However, the hell has only just begun. If you're unlucky enough to be charmed, I'm afraid there is a fate far worse in store for you than simply betraying and killing everyone around you. In fact, if you're not one of the charmed ones and you are brought down quickly, I would wager that you're probably the lucky ones. This is due to the fact that she possesses a second spell, and it should be noted that we've only ever seen 2 spells from Magnolia: Charm and a spell she calls Dream Eater. Now, Dream Eater takes quite a while to prepare, so oftentimes individuals that are charmed will basically protect her like an honor guard, sacrificing themselves, once again, in order to protect her while she prepares a massive runic circle on the ground that will then rise into the air. The second that the spell is fully prepared, but not activated, everybody who has been killed as a direct or indirect result of charm, as well as those who are actively still charmed, will suddenly go completely rigid, their heads tossed up to the sky, and an incredibly thick black smoke erupts from every orifice along the body. This includes the ear canals, the nasal canals, the mouth, even from the eyes, and in some rare cases, even coming out of the sweat glands in your body. This black smoke immediately travels up, sort of in a sphere, all the way up to the runic circle in the sky. What these black smoke orbs are is an individual soul, completely corrupted and scorched. Now, normally, souls can't be seen, and souls do exist. Normally, they can't be seen, and they don't really have a color. However, in situations where they're actually represented in a visual sense, they're typically this bluish-white color, and usually an amorphous blob that kind of just floats around. However, again, normally, these aren't visible. Now, when these smoky souls, these scorched and destroyed souls, reach the runic circle, they immediately power it, and once the spell is fully activated, it raises golden warriors from the ground that continue to march forward in lockstep, each in a perfect row. Any projectile that is fired upon them is completely ineffectual with the exception of magic. However, you require some incredibly powerful magic to be able to actually damage these things. Not only this, but they fire in unison, literally firing entire walls of unidentified energy that absolutely rip through enemy formations. Not only this, but the spell is directly connected to the amount of souls that have been consumed by the spell, each soul summoning forth thousands, maybe even tens of thousands of these golden specters that continue to rise and march forward across the battlefield. You can see how Magnolia is a bit of a problem, and she's very difficult to deal with because even if you have range on her, like if you have a sniper rifle and you're far enough away where the smoke isn't affecting you, odds are you'll end up shooting soldiers that are charmed rather than actually hitting her. And even if you do shoot her, she is a succubus, specifically a devourer succubus, which means she can take a hit. Now, I'm not saying that she can tank an anti-material rifle, but she can certainly take some damage, which makes her incredibly difficult to deal with. Not only this, but she's oftentimes and only exclusively sent into battlefields where the possibility of her being assassinated is incredibly low. Now, beyond the commanders is the High Cyratin Commander, and there's only a single individual, and this is basically the middle person. They receive orders from the Cyratin Supreme Commander, and they divvy it out to the 4 standard commanders, who then divvy it out to whatever branch of the Cyratin military they're in charge of. The High Cyratin Commander is supposed to be as powerful as the 4 standard commanders. Should the High Cyratin Commander ever go rogue, it's basically all 4 commanders have to working together, have to be strong enough to take them down. That's under normal circumstances. The current High Cyratin Commander is anything but normal, as this individual has been around for an incredibly long time. His name is Zion, and I'm going to be honest, Zion kind of needs his own deep dive. He's been around for an incredibly long time. He has a lot of lore on him, but suffice to say, when Zion goes onto the battlefield, even if it's a battlefield that spans the entire surface of a planet, or even a battlefield that spans an entire solar system, there is nothing that will stop him from achieving his goal. He is an absolute monster on the battlefield who possesses abilities that can quite literally just melt through enemy armor. It doesn't matter how thick the tank armor is, he will melt through it. So we'll get to Zion on his own deep dive. Suffice to say, though, the High Cyratin Commander is an absolute powerhouse. Now, you may think that the next logical step is the Cyratin Supreme Commander. Obviously, he has to be stronger than the High Cyratin Commander, right? Well, no. The Supreme Commander is specifically just an individual who is in charge of the entirety of the Cyratin military, and he doesn't have any power requirements. He doesn't have to be X powerful, or X times more powerful than the High Commander. He's simply just a figurehead that makes decisions for the entirety of the Cyratin military. So, we can actually go to the next branch that is important, and this is specifically the Cyratin Natural Disasters, otherwise known as the Cyratin Mages Corps. The Cyratin Mages Corps is an old project. The Cyratin Empire understood that technology can only go so far, and with more and more enemies arising with more and more powerful magical capabilities, they had to have some sort of counter. They couldn't continue to rely on the people we'll get to later. As a result, they made a program. The name of this program has long since been lost to time, but its sole purpose was this. It was designed to create an army of mages that were consistently equal in terms of their magical capabilities, but were capable of basically equaling the strength of an army that is 10 million strong with only 10,000 individuals. As a result, they are incredibly powerful. It's a reason why they're called the Natural Disasters. Each and every single one of them is capable of creating magical spells that are on a quite literal natural disaster level. We're talking things like hurricanes, earthquakes, tsunamis, and tornadoes. Stuff like that for the natural disasters is incredibly simple for them to do. Now, unfortunately, there isn't any named individuals within the natural disasters. However, suffice to say, these are individuals who can easily be deployed on any battlefield, are capable of casting spells that can easily change the course of the war on that battlefield immensely in their favor. So let's go to the next tier. This being the Cyratin Calamity Candidates. Now, we'll get to the Cyratin Calamities in just a moment, but we need to talk about the Calamity Candidates. When you get to the level of a natural disaster, as I've said, you're capable of casting spells that are on a natural disaster level. The Calamity Candidates, on the other hand, are a whole nother mixed bag of nuts. There are only 5 individuals that can hold the title of Calamity Candidate, and they are quite literally candidates to become Cyratin Calamities. Now, one thing that needs to be known is that Cyratin Calamities didn't always exist, and in fact, the Mages Corps, i.e. the Natural Disasters, didn't used to hold their current title. The Mages Corps used to simply just be known as the Mages Corps. This is way back in the lore. This is back when the individuals who currently called themselves the Cyratin Calamities simply called themselves the Natural Disasters. Because back then, these individuals were on the level of natural disaster, and back then that was considered world-ending. These individuals could march onto the battlefield and completely unopposed wipe out entire armies on their own. But eventually their power continued to grow more and more and more, and eventually simply calling these titanic individuals natural disasters was honestly starting to be seen as insulting. As a result, the old program to create the Magus Corps was created, replacing the natural disasters, or, well, becoming them. And the individuals who used to be the natural disasters became the Cyratin Calamities. Unfortunately, not all of them made the cut, and as a result, 2 of them ended up becoming Cyratin Calamity candidates. One of them ended up stepping down due to circumstances outside of their control, shall we say, whilst one of them continues to be a Cyratin Calamity candidate. Now, it's actually one of the Cyratin Calamities that hosts trials every once in a while. And these trials are very simple. There's 2 different kinds. The first is testing whether or not a candidate is finally ready, by whatever they decide the criteria being, to be elevated to the mantle of Cyratin Calamity. The other trial is when there is a Calamity candidate position that is open, and at this point he'll host a trial, or basically it's more of like a big ass tournament between all of the higher ranking natural disasters, and whoever wins this big ass showdown will eventually be elevated to Calamity candidate. Now we'll actually go over each of the Calamity candidates. One of them, for sure, deserves his own deep dive, but we're going to go a little bit into them. So let me pull up my little notepad here. Okie dokie. So, as of currently, as I said, there are 5 Cyratin Calamity candidates. These individuals are known as April, Valeria, Isaiah, Millie, and Rhinell. Now, exactly what position they hold doesn't matter. Whether they're the first Calamity candidate or the 5th, it doesn't matter. They don't really have a ranking system. They are simply Calamity candidates. And it should be noted that, as I've said multiple times at this point, a natural disaster is on a natural disaster scale. Given the perfect set of circumstances, they can literally wipe out an entire planet's population. However, this is incredibly rare. Calamity candidates, on the other hand, they're so much worse. To say that they could single-handedly take out an entire solar system on their own is a bit of an understatement. Now, I do realize what I just said there, because we just said that Zion was capable of such a thing. However, the difference between Zion and a Calamity candidate, whilst both of them could wipe out an entire solar system worth of population, Zion, whilst incredibly powerful, still requires the assistance of the military, in whatever form that may be, whereas a Calamity candidate requires no such assistance. Perhaps the only assistance they need is a shuttle that ferries them around from planet to planet. So, the first character we'll go over is Millie, or Millanova, known as the Scaled Assassin. Now, we haven't really gone into minor races within Shattered Legacies. However, we will be going over one right now, and that is the Kobolds. Kobolds do exist in Shattered Legacies. It is... The best way to remember Shattered Legacies is it's a combination of sci-fi and fantasy. Obviously, we have incredibly advanced technology and magic, so at that point, why wouldn't something like a kobold, or an elf, or a dwarf, or an orc exist within Shattered Legacies? It's common sense. Now, normally, a kobold is incredibly frail. They are incredibly small. They have very thin bones. Whilst they do have scaled hides, they're not particularly powerful. Essentially, they're not designed for the battlefield. Usually, however, kobolds, what they lack in combat prowess, they make up for in sheer mental capabilities. A lot of kobolds within the Cyratin Empire hold high ranks within the military, such as strategists and even naval commanders and captains. Not only this, but one of the biggest locations that you can always find kobolds in is the mercantile business. They make fantastic merchants, and they're very good at it as well. That is until we get to little Milanova. Milanova decided that although she does possess all of the flaws of a kobold, she wasn't going to let that stop her. One thing about kobolds is that they're very quick, and apparently Milanova won the lottery because she is fast on a level that should be impossible. Now, one thing that should be noted with Calamity candidates, as well as the Calamities, is magic isn't a requirement. You don't need magic. It certainly helps, but there are two Calamities, as well as Milanova herself and Valeria, that don't really use magic too frequently. I mean, I guess Valeria does use it very frequently, but they rely purely on martial prowess. And Millie is absolutely one of them. Whilst Millie doesn't have any magical capabilities, she does have this bizarre effect that's almost a pseudo-magic. And that is that there seems to be some sort of time dilation properties around her. Almost like this bubble that causes everything inside of it to slightly slow down, whilst also increasing her own speed because she's still moving at normal speed. As a result, this helps to increase her movement speed even farther. Now, Millie herself wears a skin-tight, or I guess in this case, a scale-tight bodysuit. And the reasoning for this is because Millie has capitalized on that agility. Everything that she does is based off of agility. She has to be able to go as fast as possible in order to maintain her rank as a Cyratin Calamity candidate. However, due to her obvious shortcomings, due to her species, she's most likely never going to become a Calamity proper, as she's simply just too frail. Now, whilst this body glove certainly does help because it has a corrodium nanoweave in it, it once again isn't super durable. It's designed to streamline her body as much as possible, reducing drag of the air around her in order to allow her to go even faster. So as a result, although it does have corrodium nanoweave, it's still not very durable. It means that she can easily take something like an anti-material round to the chest and still move, but she's probably going to suffer some internal bleeding at a very minimum as a result of that shot. Now, keep in mind, within Shattered Legacies, somebody using something as primitive, shall we say, as an anti-material ballistics rifle is highly unlikely. And this is one of the reasons why the Cyratin Empire still has an advantage, because we're getting a little off topic, but when it comes to Shattered Legacies, everybody relies on incredibly advanced technology. Well, what's a more advanced form of bullets? Well, probably energy-based weaponry. And as a result, basically everybody and their mother has capitalized into energy-based weapons. As a result, actual body armor like Kevlar or hell, even medieval plate mail, it's not really necessary anymore. You know, every single piece of armor, while still certainly having some durability behind it to protect against any possible munitions that are kinetic, they largely have this sort of, what's a good way to put it? Almost like a paint primer coating along their entire set of armor. And what this does is it dissipates energy at a very high efficiency. As a result, you can get shot with something like a laser or even a plasma bolt, which under normal circumstances, a plasma bolt would absolutely melt clean through your armor and instantaneously evaporate all of the liquids in your body. Look it up. That's actually real. That's not Shattered Legacies. Plasma, when it comes into contact with a body, is horrifying. But anyway, this energy basically lacquer that is all over the armor basically dissipates an enormous amount of the energy. So that plasma bolt, instead of just melting clean through the armor plate, it basically dissipates, basically like there's an energy shield there, and goes around the individual. there's still damage that is being done, especially when we get to higher and higher caliber energy weapons, such as even just plasmite and solstite, never mind antimatter, which I don't even think would even work. However, as a result, the Cyratin Empire kind of noticed this. Everybody has this, again, energy-based lacquer on their armor. Either that or they have actual personal shields, but nobody really has legitimate armor anymore, to protect against kinetic blows. And as a result, it's not super frequent, but the Cyratin Emperor will just be like, fuck you, and just throws in some kinetic weapons. And everybody just gets absolutely minced as a result, because their armor isn't designed to take something like a 7.62 caliber round to the chest. It's designed to take an energy round to the chest. And as a result, they'll just absolutely mince everyone that's in front of them. And then, the next battlefield over, they'll just go back to pure energy weapons. It's infrequent enough where the enemy is like, shit, they use kinetic weapons. But it's not common enough, we need to start making actual kinetic body armor. And even if they did reach that point, they likely would be back in the medieval era, because body armor like that is considered to be so incredibly primitive that in an era where energy armor is so important, they don't remember how to make things like a ballistics vest. In modern day society, we understand how to make a ballistics vest, and as a result, it makes us very resistant to bullets, dogs barking. When people say, you have a plate carrier or something like that, or even just a Kevlar vest that is bulletproof, no. Bulletproof doesn't exist. There is nothing that is bulletproof. You have something that is traveling at the speed of sound hitting you. Unless you have something that is incredibly thick, like maybe an inch plate of armor, we're talking about something like a 9mm round here, nothing is bulletproof. It's bullet resistant, because that armor, no matter what it is, will deform, because that's literally the purpose of a bullet, is to penetrate through armor. And as a result, armor will deform around the impact site. It is bullet resistant. And as a result, the Cyratin Empire fully understands this technology, but everybody else is scratching their head like, how in the fuck are we supposed to make armor that protects against this? Now, that's incredibly long-winded, and it seems to be completely and utterly off-topic, but it actually is on topic, and this is because everything that Millie has on her, whilst being incredibly streamlined, is also designed for kinetic warfare. She has actual weapons. Granted, they're fucking hand cannons, which the fact that she doesn't instantly snap her wrist when firing these things is impressive to begin with. They're pistols that are single round chambered, and she only uses them as a last resort, but they're chambered in 50 BMG, which is what the big fuck-off sniper rifles use. This isn't something that you normally put in something like a pistol. When you hear 50 caliber pistol, you're thinking of a Desert Eagle. That's 50 caliber Action Express. That is very different from BMG. That is a significantly smaller caliber. But as a result, she has these weapons, which means if she points them at anybody, never mind the fact that she's probably going to snap her wrist just pulling the trigger of this thing from sheer recoil, she's going to put a massive fucking hole in anybody that is standing in front of her. However, as I said, these are used as a last resort. Millie's primary weapons is mono-edge blades. Now, I think we've gone over this topic before. The differences between vibro and mono-edge. Vibro is basically the blade of the, knife, sword, whatever you're using. The blade itself is vibrating at hypersonic speeds. It's essentially, it's not moving at light speed, but it's basically you turn your knife into a light speed chainsaw. That's what a vibro knife is. And it vibrates at hypersonic speeds, and basically when it comes into contact with something, it just jigsaws its way through whatever whatever it's touching. However, mono-edged, on the other hand, is... So, if you were to look at the edge of a knife under a microscope or something, you wouldn't actually see a straight line like what you see. Like if you pick up a knife, one that isn't serrated, you see it's just nice, flat. But what it actually is under microscopic level is it's a bunch of teeth like you would see in a saw. And when you are cutting something, this is one of the reasons why they say don't push down, drag the knife, cut with it. It's because all of those tiny little teeth are basically just like a saw, like a construction saw. They're dragging across and constantly pulling material off. And that's one of the reasons why blades become dull, is because those little tiny microscopic teeth are suddenly bent over at maybe a 90-degree angle. And by sharpening them, you're realigning those teeth so that they're straight. Well, mono-edge technology is taking that from that level all the way down to the subatomic level. They're taking the molecules of the edge of the blade and sharpening them. So theoretically, with a mono-edged blade, what it does is it doesn't just cut a material. It's cutting the atomic bonds of something. So theoretically, a mono-edged blade can cut through literally anything. Now, that being said, mono-edge technology, even for somebody like the Cyratin Empire, is extraordinarily rare. It is an incredibly difficult process, even for the Cyratin Empire to undertake, and it is extremely expensive, even with the absolutely fucking broken economy that the Cyratin Empire has. And as a result, it's typically only high-ranking nobles that will have these, and they're usually, they're in a display case. Like, look how rich I am. I have a mono-edged blade. Isn't this just fancy as all hell? That's what they're using them for. It's very rare for somebody in the military to actively be using mono-edged because they are incredibly valuable. Because, like I said, they're capable of cutting through practically anything with no resistance whatsoever. So as a result, you don't want to give it to just some common Joe, especially if it's something that's very difficult to produce, because if it gets stolen, suddenly now your enemies have it, and they could give it to some master assassin that just comes up and just sinks it into you and just scurries away into the dark, and you have no fucking clue what just happened. However, coming all the way full circle back to Milanova once more, her primary weapon is a pair of dual mono-edged short swords. Well, short swords for us as normal humans. For her, they're basically broadswords, borderline great swords, because she's so much smaller. It's one of the reasons why one of the bits of lore of Warhammer 40k that I absolutely love is the Astartes. They have combat knives on them, and I've actually brought this up in a previous episode. They have combat knives on them. When they hold these things, it looks like an actual knife. When a normal, unaugmented human holds it, it's a fucking broadsword. They are so big, and it's sort of the same situation. For us, it's a short sword, but for her, because she's so much smaller, it's basically a broadsword or greatsword. And so as a result, Millie's primary form of attack is lightning fast speeds. Her bodysuit does actually increase her overall movement speed. It basically provides a whole suite of different advantages that are tailor-made for the way that she fights. Now, that was incredibly long, and we've only gone through one of the 5 Calamity candidates. This is going to be a long episode. Calamity candidate number 2 is Valeria, known as the Giant's Fist. So she basically, the majority of these Calamity candidates basically have combat styles that are similar to actual calamities. Valeria has a combat style very similar to the most physically powerful out of all the Cyratin calamities. I just punched my keyboard. Nice job, me. Valeria does have magic. However, it's more of a pseudo-unique magic. When we talked about the magic system, we had talked about the fact that there are unique class spells. And these are things like, I've talked about them multiple times, we haven't done a deep dive just yet, Duran. He has molten magic. It is a type of unique type magic, is a type of magic that is so insanely powerful that you aren't capable of using any other type of magic. Even something like Archaic, which normally, no matter how far into magic you go, you can always use Archaic. No matter what, you can always use it. A unique type magic blocks access to all other types of magic. It's for Duran, he can use molten magic and only molten magic. He can't even use weaker forms of fire magic. It's only molten magic. Another one that we're going to be getting to here soon is Isaiah, who uses winter magic, and it's the exact same. Isaiah can only use winter magic. He can't use ice magic. As a result, anybody who has a unique type of magic, oftentimes they are slated to become a Cyratin calamity, at the very least if they can master their unique magic. But this isn't a guarantee. Now, back to the original topic of Valeria, who has a pseudo-unique magic, and is known as shaped detonation magic, and is a rather unique one, and honestly is perfectly tailored for her. She is quite literally... she's basically a street brawler, you know? Her weapons in war, it's not a rifle, it's not swords, it's not a bow, it's her fists. And she has incredible physical prowess. In fact, she's probably the only one of the Cyratin Calamity candidates that actually has essentially become an idol. You know, she's essentially like a celebrity because she started out her life, which we actually have a bit of backstory for her. She started out her life as a boxer, which, oddly enough, boxing does exist in Shadow Legacies, in the Cyratin Empire specifically. But regardless, she made one hell of a name for herself. She is incredibly physically powerful to the point where she was considered equivalent to a natural disaster through physical prowess alone. Now, that being said, she wasn't capable of punching something so hard that it was like an earthquake happened, but she was insanely physically powerful, and then eventually her magic activated. She gained access to her magic. She is essentially like a late bloomer. These do exist within magic. Not everybody has access to their magic right off the start at birth. For some people, it takes an incredibly long time for them to gain access to their very first magic. For some people, it's available, like I said, at birth. So she gained access to her magic, which was shaped detonation magic, and what it does is she's capable of creating explosions anywhere along her body, but she's capable of creating a shaped charge. Now, what is a shaped charge? A shaped charge is basically taking the force of an explosion and focusing it in a specific direction. It is quite literally shaped, and as a result, things like breaching charges, that's what they are. A breaching charge is a form of shaped charge. It is an explosion that is focused within a singular point that is capable of just blasting and ripping apart whatever they're trying to breach. In fact, one of the most basic forms of a shaped charge is a claymore. I think everybody should know what a claymore is. If you don't know what a claymore is, look it up on Google. You won't be put on a list, I promise you. You know, but a claymore it's literally an explosion that happens in one singular direction. It's a shaped charge. It's as simple as it gets for a shaped charge. However, Valeria is capable of taking this to an absolute extreme. So not only is she capable of creating shaped charges anywhere along her body, she's even capable of adjusting just how much explosive force is created and outputted. As a result, she can create a detonation on her left shoulder to ward off somebody that's maybe as powerful as a stick of dynamite. And then if she needs to get through some sort of fortification, she can literally punch something and create an explosion at her knuckles that has the same level of force as, say, a Tomahawk cruise missile, just because. You know? And as a result, she is incredibly powerful. However, the explosions can only occur on her body, unless something has received an explosion and survived it, at which point it is marked and she can create a remote detonation on that location, but only on that location. Only on the location that she struck with her explosion. So let's say she's going up against her mentor, which her mentor can definitely take hits like this, and she punches him in the stomach and creates an explosion equivalent to, let's say, a hand grenade. He can easily shrug this off with no damage whatsoever. But now there's essentially a marker on his stomach, and she can just focus on it, click her fingers, and another explosion will occur right where her fist hit on his stomach. It won't spawn, it won't detonate anywhere else, it won't detonate on the side of his head unless she hit him in the side of the head. Furthermore, it's not guaranteed that this mark will occur. She's still relatively new to her magic. She hasn't quite mastered it yet because she's only recently gained access to it. However, what she has gained access to so far is cataclysmic. In fact, she's capable of outputting at an absolute maximum, which puts some serious pain on her mentor, an explosion roughly around 200 megatons of nuclear power. Now, keep this in mind. If I'm remembering the numbers correctly, the largest nuclear device ever detonated was the Russians' Tsar-Bomba, which not only was so violent that the shockwave was felt around the planet 3 times, and it literally vaporized the island that it was put on. It was, I believe, 50 kilotons. Keep in mind, if you know your metric system, kilo is before mega, which means that the amount of explosive power that she is capable of outputting was, God, I don't even know. It takes 1,000 kilotons to equal 1 megaton. So you can do the math there. It's that many times more powerful than the largest nuclear device ever detonated on Earth's soil, and was also, I believe, the reason why nuclear testing was outright made illegal by the UN, because they looked at what the Russians did and was like, yeah, we can't do this on the planet anymore. This is dangerous and stupid. Which, to be fair, they're not wrong. So as a result, Valeria is insanely powerful. However, she has some added bonuses. Thanks to her natural physical capabilities, her body is incredibly durable. It should be noted that her species is human. She's not even Cyratin, which does confirm a question that some of you may be having is, are humans allowed in the Cyratin Empire, despite the fact that they have an eternal blood war with one another? Yes, there are situations in which humans are allowed into the Cyratin Empire. Usually humans are exempt from gaining Cyratin citizenship, which is only given to a select few that serve in the military or other branches of the Cyratin Empire for X amount of time, but they are capable of joining the Cyratin Empire. They won't become Cyratin citizens unless they are a family that has been in the Cyratin Empire for an incredibly long time. We're talking thousands of generations, so damn long that any possibility of their family being spies for the human empire are basically non-existent at that point. The family has been in the Cyratin Empire for so damn long, they likely don't even remember why they came to the empire, And Valeria is one of them. She has served as a Cyratin Calamity candidate for a respectable amount of time, only roughly around, I think, 50 years, which sounds shocking, especially given the fact that her age is, she looks and acts and is biologically somebody who is, in her mid-20s. Despite the fact that she is significantly older than that, and we'll get to why in just a bit. But yeah, so that's Valeria. Next up, we have April, which her full name is April Bosphorus. Now that may sound a little familiar because we've talked about a certain man multiple times who also has the last name Bosphorus. Specifically, our good old boy Duran, the strongest motherfucker to have ever existed, period, has a little sister. Her name is April, and her title is the Hellfire Princess. So, we haven't gone over a true deep dive of Duran, obviously, just yet. We will soon. Honestly, probably the next episode, but regardless. Duran won the lottery. Not only does he have a unique magic, but he is unique in the sense that his magic and his trait melded together, which is an impossibility. It's never happened to anybody else. Duran is wholly unique in that fact. He's the only person to have ever been born with a trait and magic that have melded together at some point. However, it appears as though this uniqueness was not just a one-off job, because his little sister April is also unique in the fact that she possesses two unique class magics, or two unique type magics. This is specifically Infernal Hellfire, which is an utterly bizarre magic that has semi-demonic capabilities because it does utilize hellfire, which is normally only available to demons, so it's a bit of a weird one, as well as Ashland magic, which is also a unique type of magic because it directly allows for the manipulation of ash, similar to how molten magic in its most basic form allows for the manipulation of molten material. And as a result, she turns into an absolute monster on the battlefield. Now, is she comparable to her older brother Duran? No, she is significantly weaker than her brother. Is she capable of taking out an entire planet's population in less than a few hours? Absolutely. So basically, the way that her magic works is she is capable of creating fire all across the battlefield, but this fire is a little bit weird as it turns anything it comes into contact to into ash, with the exception of some metals, which become a molten state, which she can't utilize. She does have some actual attacks with her fire magic, but by and large, the Infernal Hellfire is primarily designed for the production of ash, at which point she can control it and manipulate it, and has a whole host of different abilities, including, and not limited to, turning the entire atmosphere of the planet into an ashy hellstorm that will quite literally suffocate anybody who does not have proper respiration equipment, which largely means if you're not in an environmental suit, you're gonna die. And she's capable of even superheating the ash almost to the point of fire and just spraying it across the battlefield and just causing unimaginable agony to anybody who comes into direct contact with this ash. She's even capable of doing this with ash she doesn't have direct contact with or a direct link to her magic. Such as ash that could be on the opposite side of the planet, she's capable of exerting her magical force upon it and manipulating it. As a result, she's absolute hell to fight against, as you can imagine. Unfortunately, we're not going to be going too far into April, largely because a lot of her backstory is also with Duran in some way, shape, or form. So we're likely going to do a deep dive on her when we do Duran's deep dive. Primarily focus on Duran, but there'll also be details for April there. Next up is Isaiah Tempera, the Winter General. Once again, as I said previously, Isaiah honestly deserves his own deep dive. He was one of the original natural disasters back before the Mages Corps existed, just like Duran. However, the individual who's in charge of these trials deemed him incapable of outputting enough magical power in order to equivalate a calamity, and as a result has been a calamity candidate for a very long time. Honestly, though, I don't think he cares. I honestly don't. He's basically the Cyratin Empire's master strategist. Like, if there's any situation that they require a particularly fine touch of strategic know-how, they go to Isaiah. He is the guy. And as a result, that's one of the reasons why he's called the Winter General. you know? And as a result, I don't think he really cares at this point becoming a calamity. In fact, I think he would be okay with being a natural disaster and still having the same responsibilities because I honestly don't think he gives a shit. So we'll go over him at another time. The final of the Cyratin Calamity candidates is known as Rhinel Ezekiel, known as the Prince of Elements. Rhinel also, just like Valeria, has a pseudo-unique magic in the fact that he has total control over all elemental magics. Similar to Molly Jackson with her Sage trait that just allows her to have every single type of magic with absolutely no limitations, he's similar, but only with like true raw elemental magics. We're talking about fire, ice, water, lightning, air, earth, all those good stuff. Anything that is considered to be elemental, he has complete and utter mastery over them. Not only that, but he appears to have some sort of reality manipulation magic that we're not entirely sure what the hell is going on there. It's not normal reality manipulation because, of course, that's the type of magic. I don't know, it's difficult to describe, and the Cyratin Empires, even their best mages, don't really understand it. Not only that, but Rhino rarely ever uses it. So as a result, there's not exactly a lot of situations where they can actually analyze it and figure out what in the fuck is he doing, you know? Rhinel, again, just like Isaiah, I know you guys are probably getting sick of this. He requires his own deep dive, although there's not that much information about Rhinel. He's relatively new to the scene. However, one thing that is known is that he seems to be spending a lot of time with the Cyratin Empress, Molly Jackson. Not really sure what's going on there. It's clearly a teacher-student type of situation, but nobody's really sure what the hell their connection to one another is, or why the Empress would have such fascination with him. Now, we're reaching the end here, I promise you. This episode's probably quite long already. Beyond the Cyratin Calamity candidates are the big boys, the Cyratin Calamities themselves. In order to become a Cyratin Calamity, you have to be an individual that defies magical understanding, or even physical understanding. These are individuals who a battle could be waged across an entire galaxy, or even an entire universe, and they could probably single-handedly deal with the entire warfront on their own. And oftentimes, depending on which of the 8 calamities we're talking about, their mere presence alone can cause complete and utter retreat or surrender on the enemy side, regardless of how important the battle may be to them. As I just said, there are 8 calamities in total. Going down the list in no particular order, as once again, just like the candidates, they don't really have a ranking system. We have the first Cyratin Calamity, the Molten King Duran Bosmer. Second up, we have the second Calamity, the Scarlet Devil Faust, followed by the Astral Lord Raymond von Ulcia. So just as a quick stop here, remember when I had said that there was the Calamity candidate trials? Raymond is the one that's in charge of that, just so you guys are aware. The fourth Cyratin Calamity is the Blade Lord Mikaela, followed by the King of Flames Baylor, which I do need to change his name. It might be the Master of Flames instead of the King of Flames. Sixth place goes to God Blessed, Yandril Jackson, followed by the Imperial Prince himself, Alex Jackson, and finally in 8th, we have the Crimson Samurai Benimaru. So let's actually go over the Calamity candidates. So we have Isaiah Tempera, who has been around for so long, he's obviously not a student of one of the Calamities. We have Milanova, or Millie, the Scaled Assassin, who is the student of the Crimson Samurai Benimaru. We have Rhinel Ezekiel, who is the student of the Empress, Molly Jackson, who, yeah, we don't know the exact situation. I had mentioned before that there was a Calamity candidate that is no longer one, that's the Cyratin Empress Molly Jackson. She was formerly one of the Cyratin Calamity candidates, the most powerful. In fact, her magical capabilities are on par with Calamity's, but due to her position as Empress, you probably don't want to be sending her into the battlefield. I'm just going to leave it at that. Next up, we have Valeria the Giant's Fist, who is the student of Yondril Jackson, so-called the God Blessed. And finally, April Bosphorus. I bet you can't guess who her teacher is. If you guessed her older brother Duran, you would be correct. So, we're going to do just a very brief once-over for each of the calamities. We're not going to go super in-depth because, honestly, each of these 8 individuals, you guys are getting sick of it, requires their own deep dive, which we will get to them. Duran. So one thing I need to say first is this. The title of King and Queen. When we're talking about a singular planet, King and Queen is obviously used as a rank of monarch. You are the king of the kingdom, or you are the queen of the kingdom, or even the king and queen of the planet. It's very similar to just what you imagine a king and a queen to be, like the Queen of England, that sort of situation. However, when you start getting to the major factions, the term king and queen are never used. Each of the different factions, they have their own rulers, but none of them are called kings and queens. The Cyratin Empire obviously have the Emperor and the Empress. The humans have simply just the President. The Bastilians, I believe, have the Prime Minister. The Yvetans have what are known as the Council of Archmages. And we don't really know what the Barramons are because the Barramon are far too pissed off to tell anybody. So as a result, when major factions, especially all of the major factions, recognize somebody as a king or a queen, we're not talking about a monarch. We're talking about what is known as the kings and queens of reality. Individuals that are given the title of king or queen are individuals that are so insanely powerful that their capabilities, whether they be physical or magical, which for all of the kings and queens is magical, it goes so far beyond even the wildest imaginations of what even just the normal calamities are capable of, that to call them anything short than a king and queen of reality, it's just not proper at that point. Because, as I've said before, a king does as a king pleases. And as you may have noticed from the title, Duran is the Molten King. Duran's power is so far beyond what anybody else is capable of producing that he is without a doubt one of the kings of reality. And there are 4 people in total who have received this unique honor of king or queen. The first is Duran, the Molten King. The second is Molly Jackson, the Queen of Magic. The third is an individual known as the Crazed King, known as Rex. And the fourth one I'm currently blanking on because, of course, I would blank on it right now. But regardless, these are individuals like Molly. It makes sense. She's capable of using every single type of magic with no restriction whatsoever. To call her a queen of reality, it just makes sense. I've said multiple times, Duran is so fucking powerful that it doesn't matter what anime protagonist you throw at Duran, none of them are winning because of what he can do. It's obvious he's a king of reality. Now, we haven't talked about Rex, but we'll get into him and why he's known as the Crazed King. Actually, we did talk about him once, and that was during our Magic episode where we talked about his double trait, which is winning the fucking lottery on steroids. So, Duran uses Molten Magic, and his Molten Magic allows him to convert anything that is around him into molten material, regardless of whether or not it possesses a molten state. Like rock and metal. Those obviously, they become molten. You have molten rock and molten iron, molten silver, molten brass, whatever. But even things like clothing and plants. Normally those burn. They don't melt. Well, because of Duran's magic, something like a plant will melt. It'll turn into a molten plant. Now, I don't know how the fuck you do something like that, let alone what a molten plant even is, but he's capable of doing it. And as a result, you can't fire projectiles at him, whether they be ballistic or energy, because the second they hit this little heat shield he has around him, they immediately immolate on contact, turning into more molten material for him to use. Even magical spells have this effect. And this is one of the reasons why I said there is no anime protagonist you have out there that can beat Duran, because no matter what you throw at him, even individuals who have reality manipulating magic have gone against Duran, nothing can get to his body. Because everything, even things that are warping the concept of reality around him, are turned into a molten state in an instant. Next up, we have the Scarlet Devil Faust. And Faust is a bit of an interesting one. He is not only in lore, not only in lore, but also in universe. He is incredibly new. He doesn't have a lot of lore behind him just yet, but I am crafting more of it as we speak. So his deep dive is probably going to take a while, like down the road a while. Not his deep dive will be a long episode, because there's just not a lot of information about him right now. So we'll kind of just skip him for right now, and we'll go to Raymond Ulcia, the Astral Lord, who utilizes gravity manipulation magic. Raymond is hell incarnate. And I don't mean that in a fire brimstone kind of way. I mean, whatever you imagine your personal hell to be, Raymond probably has it matched. Raymond is capable of manipulating the concept of gravity as a whole. As a result, he's capable of just like, he can just look at you and just like concentrate on the very center part of your brain and just create like a micro pocket of hyper-condensed gravity that just instantaneously turns your brain into like a pea-sized ball of mass, and the rest of your head is completely untouched, unscathed. Your skull hasn't been damaged or deformed in any way, and now you're just dead. And that's something that that's something that Raymond can do. Like, he can create literal singularities and black holes wherever he wants, and just suck in entire armies into hyper-condensed gravitational forces, and just turn them into just, like, ping-pong ball-sized balls of mass. Like, you can take an entire battle tank the size of an M1 Abrams and turn it into a pea that's laying on the ground. That's just something he can do. And as a result, he can literally just very calmly and slowly walk across the battlefield. No rush, no worry about, oh, I may be hit by a stray round. Just casually and very calmly walking across the battlefield, because he has an ability, he's completely unconscious of it. He has no clue that he's doing it normally. And he doesn't have a name for it. In fact, all of Raymond's abilities spells are wholly unique. He created them himself, and he doesn't have a name for this one. But it's basically pockets of gravity that exist all across the battlefield in a massive circle around him, and sometimes even a sphere, depending on what's going on. And entering these pockets of gravity, one of three things will happen. 1, nothing will happen whatsoever. 2, it'll be like you're all of a sudden in a low G environment, a low gravity environment, like you're on the moon or something. And 3, once again, you turn into a ping pong ball. And there is no telling which one it's going to be, and there is absolutely no way of detecting these things unless you're looking for gravitational forces through scans. And there are so many of these pockets, and they're not persistent. They blink in and out of reality. So there's constantly, like, you could take a step forward and stand completely still, and for like one fraction of a second, you're perfectly fine. Nothing is happening. And then suddenly there's just a pocket of intense gravity right on your right side, and your entire right torso just evaporates but the rest of you is perfectly fine because you're not in the bubble. And then you just, like, you start slumping over to the right side, and all of a sudden your body just starts floating randomly because that pocket of intense gravity just blinks out of existence and then was replaced by a pocket of low gravity. And it's just absolute carnage everywhere he walks. Like, he doesn't need to cast any spells. The dude just has to walk forward. He's a walking natural disaster in of himself without even using any spells. It's absolutely crazy. Next up, we have the Blade Lord Mikaela, whose other title is the Guardian or the Shield of the Emperor. He is almost always seen the Cyratin Emperor, and as his title entails, he is the Blade Lord. His magic is blade magic, which creates an innumerable amount of blades in the air that he is directly capable of controlling. Fun fact, he wasn't always capable of doing this. In the old lore, he could only control maybe 8 or 9 blades at any given time. Now, these blades are they're literally his magic. They're not actual physical blades that were smithed by a blacksmith. They just appear, and they're purely made of magic. And he can control them however he wishes. He can directly hold on to them, and the dude is a fucking legend when it comes to blade work. Like, the only person who can has him beat is Benimaru, which we'll get to in just a little bit. But, like, anybody that gets near him when he has a blade in hand, you can guarantee that they're not walking out alive, you know? And he's capable of even causing these swords to float and move autonomously. However, in the past, this required an enormous amount of mental focus. So as a result, yeah, he can have like 8 swords flying around attacking 8 different targets, but he is completely defenseless while this is happening, and he can't utilize any other swords. That was until he met a little special individual known as the legendary Jackson, who personally tutored him and turning him essentially into a fucking Terminator, because he went from 8 blades, having to use all of his mental focus just to control these 8 blades flying around, to he can now summon blades in the billions of strong, and they can just work completely autonomously, without him even having to even register that they exist, and they're capable of flying and attacking independently of one another, or even in massive swarms. That's Mikaela, and you can kind of see why he's kind of the perfect person to protect the Cyratin Emperor, because it's like, if his life is threatened, Mikaela could just click his fingers, and literally an entire wall of blades is just protecting them now, in every single direction. So next up, we have the Master of Flames, because I'm officially going to make that canon. He isn't one of the kings of reality. He is the Master of Flames, Balor. Balor, just like Faust, is relatively new, both in lore and in universe, so there's not a whole lot about him, but there is certainly something sketchy about him. You know, there's something about him. You just look at him, and he's, like, permanently sanguine. You know, he's always just in a good mood. You know, there's nothing that can really seem to just annoy him or change his mood from just, you know, content. He is just content at all times. Even in the middle of battle, you know, there could be body parts flying by, explosions and clouds of smoke everywhere, bullets flying in every single direction, and the dude's sitting there like a monk, just content with his life, just happy, and just ripping loose spells of just incredible power. He's not on the level of Duran, but he's certainly very powerful. In fact, he has an entire series of spells that kind of work like a play. They're known as the Sun King's Tragedy, and each spell is a different act of the tragedy. In fact, this series of spells became so incredibly popular, the Cyratin Empire actually created an opera that was known as the Sun King's Tragedy, based solely around this magic series of attacks that Balor has. It's bizarre, but that's the Cyratin Empire for you. They're bizarre at the best of times. Next up, you have Yandril and Alex Jackson, which both of them are the sons of the legendary Jackson, which already lets you know they're going to be balls to the walls insane. Legend never particularly liked magic. He could use magic, which is ironic considering Legend is literally based off of myself, and I fucking adore magic. I love anything that has to do with magic. Even just the most mundane and kind of boring of magic systems, I absolutely love it. I love magic. Which is ironic because, like I said, Legend is primarily based off of myself, and he wanted nothing to do with magic. He absolutely hated magic. He preferred to use the divine power of gods as well as physical prowess and just technique, basically. And so, as a result, his children kind of got the same thing. Alex got Legend's sheer prowess with weapons, and we'll get to Alex in just a second. Yandril, on the other hand, got Legend's sheer physical strength and divine ability. In fact, Yandril is unique because he is officially recognized as a what's the word? It's not extinct. It's I can't remember what the word is, but you get the idea. It's not extinct, but it's just before that. You know, he's on the list, and this is because he is the only one of his race. Nobody knows why this happened, why Molly Jackson gave birth to an individual who is his own wholly unique species, but he is. In fact, his species is his title, God Blessed, and nobody is really sure what it is. It's not gods. You know, gods aren't God blessed, but Yandril is just kind of his own species, just kind of chilling, hanging out. But so Yandril got Legend's sheer physical strength. In fact, his physical strength is so insane that, like, he can literally just take his fist and punch the ground at his feet. And depending on how much physical force he wants to exert in that one punch, he could do nothing more than cause a slight shaking in the environment around him, to quite literally cracking the planet in half in that instant. And it should be noted that cracking a planets are big fucking things. They are incredibly durable. So even something like in Warhammer 40k, Exterminatus, the death of a world, it takes a long time. You can't just, like, those sci-fi things where it's like, you know, it's the end, it's the credits, and the spaceship is flying away from the planet right as it just goes kaboom and explodes into a bunch of pieces. That doesn't actually happen. I mean, I guess theoretically, if you had a big enough fuck you bomb, you could, but the yields of that would have to be beyond comprehension at that point, because, like I said, planets are tough things. But so, yeah, that's something that Yandril can do. He can literally just punch a planet in half, just on contact. The second he punches it, it just cracks in half. And that's just something that he can do. One of the things I love about Yandril is that his physical power, or his physical strength, is so insane that nobody can really understand just how physically powerful he really is. And it's ironic because his divine weapon, we've talked about divine weapons before, his divine weapon is known as Cyratin. Or, was that it? I don't remember. Regardless, it's literally a 120-foot tall broadsword. A sword that is literally the size of the Statue of Liberty. And the dude can literally grab it, which, granted, his palm is like completely outstretched. You know, it's not like an actual handle that is narrow enough for him to fit his hands around. No, his hands are completely outstretched. And he just grabs it and just swings it around as if it's just like a normal broadsword. And as a result, the tip of the blade easily hits light speed whenever he's swinging it around, and just collides, just swings it at the ground, and like he didn't even need to hit his target. Just the sheer explosion of matter that occurs when this thing hits the ground is probably going to kill them regardless. Like, it's ridiculous. Next up, we have Alex Jackson. This is the second last topic that we have for today's episode, because my god, it's already been going on for way too long. Alex Jackson, as I said, got his father Legend's prowess with a blade. And the interesting thing is that Alex was born with a trait known as the War Master, which means that any weapon, no matter what the weapon is, no matter what species created the weapon, he's capable of picking it up and instantaneously and unconsciously knowing how to use that weapon at its most optimal way. Even if it's a weapon that was never designed for a human-like body, it's designed to have like some sort of tentacle go into the gun or whatever the fuck, whatever, you can use your imagination. Something that is not designed for humans to use, and he can grab it and immediately use it the way that it was intended. How? Nobody knows. But that's just something he can do. And along with that, as if that itself wasn't enough, he also has an ability known as the King's Armory. The King's Armory is a spell that is capable of duplicating any weapon that it comes into physical contact with, and it's capable of summoning it for the wielder. In this example, it's Alex. So as a result, he's literally capable of duplicating any weapon he comes into contact with and instantaneously knowing how to use it at perfect efficiency. And just has access to an infinite arsenal of weapons. So as a result, when Alex is fighting, it's not too uncommon to see him swap through like 40, 50 different weapons through the entire course of one battle. Just chaining together the advantages and benefits of various different weapons constantly with no pause between each weapon swinging. It's insane to see. Now, the final one, thank God we've reached the end because my voice hurts, is the Crimson Samurai Benimaru. And Benimaru's magic is very difficult to explain. In fact, even Benimaru himself doesn't understand what crimson magic is. However, one thing that should be known is that he very much is a samurai. His aesthetic is very interesting. He doesn't look like an actual, ancient samurai. But he does carry around a katana. In fact, he carries around 2 katanas and a smaller blade. I forget what the hell it's called. I don't remember the blade's name off the top of my head. A tanto, I think. I could be wrong. Anybody who knows this kind of stuff, don't get mad at me. I don't remember offhand. But, so he has the normal actual katana, a real katana, on his side, and it's a Cyratin made one, which means it's ultra high tech, can basically cut through almost anything, about as close as you can get to mono-edged without actually being mono-edged. Like, this thing is tricked to the nines. And then he has the smaller blade to do things like parrying and stuff and blocking. And then he has a longer blade. It's a little bit longer than a katana. I forget exactly what that type of blade is called. I really am dropping the ball here with Japanese blades. But regardless, we'll get into that blade when we do his deep dive. I'm not going to actually say anything about it because it is a fascinating one, but the effects that it has on the battlefield, we've talked about some crazy things so far, and there is way more to talk about, but that sword might be the most horrifying thing we talk about in Shattered Legacies. But, so yeah, it is incredibly late at night. My throat is absolutely tired as all hell, and that's honestly all I wanted to talk about today. So I hope you guys enjoyed today's episode, and I hope you guys are looking forward to tomorrow, Wednesday's episode, because it is not going to be a 7 Days to Die episode. You guys will get to see what it is, as well as our Friday episode, which is going to be just like Wednesday, this brand new series. We're probably only going to do our 7 Days to Dies on Monday, and this is largely because, like I said in the 7 Days to Die stream, there seemed to be more activity on the channel when I was doing other stuff rather than 7 Days to Die. It seems like people aren't super into the 7 Days to Die. I'm too determined to not let it go, so we're going to continue to do it on Mondays, and then Wednesday and Friday is going to be this brand new series, which might actually be coming out on Friday, because I still have to record episode 1. But regardless, we'll figure it out. So I hope you guys enjoyed, and I will see you guys later. See ya.